The Ontario Diagnostic Days on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, the University of Guelph, Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association, and sponsored by the Grain Farmers of Ontario, Agris Co-op, BASF, Bayer and DeKalb, Corteva and Pioneer, Great Lakes Grain, the Mosaic Company, and Syngenta.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to Ontario Diagnostic Days, episode number 4. Today we're going to focus on soil health and soil management, and we're going to kick things off with Omafra soil health specialist Anne Verhallen. Anne will share tips on which cover crops you could plant this fall to deliver immediate soil health and cover benefits throughout the winter. We'll then hear from Cameron Ogilvie from Soils at Guelph. Cam will tell us about this initiative, its research work, and ongoing efforts to promote knowledge that enhances the health of Ontario soils. Next up, we'll be joined by Omafra soil management specialist Sebastian Belliard. Sebastian will tell us about VES, the visual evaluation of soil structure, and how you can use it to monitor and maintain soil health. We'll then talk manure with Chris Brown, Omafra field crop sustainability specialist. Chris will tell us about why timing is critical when applying manure to forages. From there, we'll return to cover crops. Omafra crop innovation specialist Ian McDonald will tell us about biostrip till crop production and how growers can plant cover crops in the wheel track area to till soil in these well-traveled areas. We'll wrap up the program with University of Guelph soil scientist Doug Young. Doug looks at the role pH plays in the success of your crops and how to manage those low and high testing fields. Again, this episode, CEU credits are available to CCAs who have registered for Ontario Diagnostic Days. Look for the URL where you can apply for those credits. You'll see that on the screen at various points throughout the episode. We also want to give you an opportunity to engage with our experts. We've provided their contact information at the end of the video. We also encourage you to put your comments and your questions in our YouTube comments section as you're watching the video. Get us some questions, we'll get you some answers.
Hi, I'm Anne Verhallen. I'm a soil management specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. And today we're at part of the Ridgetown campus of the University of Guelph. This is part of the research trials, and because of COVID-19, I actually got the opportunity to have a cover crop garden. So that's what you see in the background here. It's kind of a cool opportunity this summer and has allowed me to physically distance from everybody else. So it's the end of August and you're thinking cover crops. So what can we use that's going to give us fast cover, going to suppress some weeds, maybe scavenge some nitrogen, and basically give us some protection for the ground over the winter? And maybe die and not be a problem. It won't require termination come springtime. So let's take a look at what I've got here. I've picked out a few of the different cover crops that I've been growing. One of the obvious ones right off the bat for a cover crop, for some fast cover at the end of the summer, is the spring cereals. So things like oats and barley. The oats will give you some really good growth. This is about 5 or 6 weeks worth of growth, and you can see that I've got better growth actually out of the oats than the barley. And it's funny, from watching this cover crop garden, what we've seen is I actually get faster emergence usually out of my barley than out of my oats. Granted, this is a sandy loam, it's been a hot, dry summer, but that's usually what I see. So if we're looking for fast soil coverage in the fall, one of the spring cereals, either barley or oats, would be a great option. It's easy to kill, they're going to die over winter, they're going to give us some really quick growth in that 4 to 6 week period that we still have left. The other thing, if you want to start doing some mixes, we can add in something like peas. This is a forage pea. Same planting date as these oats and barley that you see in the bucket. Not much of a root system on them, but they love to climb the cereals, and we will generate a little bit of nitrogen, help to feed those oats and barley, give a great cover. And if you're looking for some emergency forage, a combination of these would make great forage. Keep in mind that you need to adjust your seeding rate. So for a forage rate, we're doing a much higher seeding rate. If we're just doing a cover rate, we're probably a bushel of oats, maybe a bit less, and 10 or 15 pounds of peas will make a lovely cover. Now, this one I approach with some trepidation. You either love it or you hate it, and it's buckwheat. Buckwheat makes a good option down here in the southwest, even at the end of August. We'll get some decent growth out of it. As you move further east and north in the province, maybe not a good option anymore, but certainly an option after wheat harvest or spring cereal harvest. Buckwheat is one of the fastest things that will grow, cover the ground, and give you some good protection. It does have what appears to be a really wussy root system. There's a lot more going for it than what you see. It's got a very fine, fragile root system. It's going to do a great job of building soil structure, great job of shading, but that comes with a bit of a caveat. And what you'll see on this when we look a little bit closer is that this buckwheat is only about 6 weeks old, and I already have viable seeds set on this. So that's a challenge. Buckwheat's not hard to kill, but you need to be prepared for it and recognize that it's going to come back on you. This is part of the reason why I generally don't recommend buckwheat in a mix. Like I wouldn't put buckwheat in with the peas and the oats and the barley. Buckwheat by itself, I think, is a little bit easier to manage. There are people that use it in a mix. Also not a good thing to use in a mix that you're going to graze because it is an irritant for livestock. Now let's move over to this one. And here we've got some of the brassicas. Everybody's seen radish in recent years. This was quite the hot cover crop for quite a while. Another one of these fast-growing cover crops that give us a lot of very quick growth. They've got almost an umbrella type shape to their leaves, so they do great weed suppression and great job of sucking up nitrogen. The other thing with this is it will die over winter, most winters. Some winters not so much. We do have some carryover, so you always have to have that termination plan in place just in case. This is the kind of thing that it's got a root system that's a taproot, has some fine fibrous roots. The earthworms love it, so it's got a lot going for it. I don't like to see it by itself. Again, I'd rather see this in a mix with something like oats or cereal rye. There are other brassicas out there too that will give you, again, that same rapid growth and similar root architecture in that it's going to do a good job of suppressing weeds. So things like kale, again, something that we can graze as a forage. Kale, a portion of it will overwinter. In fact, a lot of the kale will overwinter. Or things like turnip. And this doesn't look too substantial just yet, but these will grow into purple top turnips, similar to what you remember feeding cattle many, many years ago. Makes a great grazing possibility. But again, same architecture in terms of roots and that umbrella-shaped leaf, so we get a lot of good weed suppression. Keep the seeding rate down on these because the seed is very tiny. And one of the last things, one of the questions I've had this year, I've had it lots of years, is I've harvested my wheat and the weeds have grown up. That's a cover crop, right? And it's cheap. I didn't have to pay for it. Mother Nature provided it. Yeah, but Mother Nature is not a drill or a planter. It's not a consistent thing. And let's take a look at some of the weeds that are out there. So these weeds I pulled, actually I dug them out, same as the cover crops, from the same area. So these have had the same amount of time to grow. We're looking at 5 or 6 weeks. We've got some pigweeds, a lamb's quarter, and some grasses in here. Yes, we've got root systems, some of them not so great. And certainly we've got taproot and fibrous root systems similar to cover crops. The problem will be that the stand isn't consistent. The other challenge is, look at, we've already got seeds ready to go. You know that old farmer's almanac type saying of 1 year's weeds, 7 years weeding. It's true. If we let these go to seed, we're going to have more problems. And if some of the point is to suppress, especially the herbicide resistant weeds, we're missing a wonderful opportunity. The other thing I'm concerned about with having weeds as your cover crop is, from a horticultural point of view anyways, many of them support some of our plant parasitic nematodes, in particular the root lesion nematode and some others. So that's a concern. Why build up populations at the end of the season when we don't need to, when we can target a cover crop that's going to help to suppress or at least make things a little bit more consistent. The key here is trying to set those fields up for good production next year. So I want to see consistent cover crops with a decent population that's consistent across the whole field. It'll make planting and establishment a whole lot easier in 2021.
Hi, my name's Cameron Ogilvie. I'm the Knowledge Mobilization Coordinator for Soils at Guelph. Soils at Guelph is a University of Guelph initiative to advance sustainable soil management in Ontario by promoting knowledge sharing among farmers, crop advisors, researchers, and other stakeholders who have a vested interest in the health of Ontario soil. Today you find me standing at the long-term rotation experiment on the Elora Crops Research Station, one of our longest running experiments. It started in 1980. This is the 40th anniversary of this experiment. You might be wondering, well, looking at common Ontario crop rotations over the past 40 years, what have we learned? And we've learned some pretty significant points. If I can sum it up, when you compare diverse crop rotations, these are crop rotations that include winter cereals and cover crops, and if you compare those with simple crop rotations, like just the corn soybean rotation that's common in Ontario, we find that corn and soybeans not only yield better in the diverse systems, but in hot and dry years, they yield 30% better in these diverse systems compared to just simple rotations like corn and soybeans. 30%. I don't know of any other agronomic practices that can make up for 30% of your yield when you're in a bad year, a hot and dry year. Which begs the question, what is it about these diverse crop rotations that make these systems so resilient to drought? Are they changing the amount of water that's available in the soil? Are they changing soil organic matter? Maybe that has an impact on it. Are they changing the nutrient availability, say nitrogen in particular? What is it about these diverse systems that makes them so resilient? In order to answer that question, the Soil Health Interpretive Center was built. This is a world-class soil health monitoring station where over 1 million data points are collected every day. The Interpretive Center features 18 weighing lysimeters. These are large soil cores that were extracted undisturbed from other environments. The native soil profile stays the same way that it was in the field.
Using an excavator, the steel outer cylinder was slowly pressed down into the soil, and the soil around the cylinder was removed. Once the lysimeter was filled, a hydraulic cutter was placed underneath the cylinder to slice through the soil at the bottom. The lysimeter was then flipped upside down, and ceramic cups to transmit water were installed before sealing the bottom. The lysimeters were then transported to the study site near Elora, Ontario. Additional sensors were installed, and finally they were lowered into the wells.
What they allow us to do is, first of all, to measure water balance, so how much water is being stored in the soil, how much is being lost from the soil due to evapotranspiration, and how much is draining from the soil. That's the water budget side of things. But they also allow us to install another of other sensors at different depths so that we can start answering these questions of how do rotations and how do cover crops impact soil health and crop productivity. Right now I'm standing inside one of the lysimeter wells, which is essentially the brains to this entire operation. Inside here we have a number of computers that are operating that measure the weight of the lysimeters, measure the weight of the drainage tanks that are on the floor, and operate pumps that pull water from the soil so that we can measure things like nitrate, or run other sensors like trace gas analyzers. The study has only been running for a few years, but already we've found some interesting results. So now we're going to jump to some of our other researchers to hear about what they've been studying on these lysimeters.
Hi everyone, my name is Gordon Bell. I'm a grad student at the University of Guelph, and today I'll be giving you a short presentation about the lysimeter research facility. So at the lysimeter research facility, we're investigating soil health and how that interacts with different soil ecosystem services. We're specifically looking at crop diversity, soil texture, and climate change. But there's a lot of different aspects to soil health that we're not able to look at. The lysimeter facility was built in 2016, and it consists of 18 1,500 liter steel drums that are embedded in the ground that are instrumented and allow us to observe what's going on within the soil. And they're going to help us answer a lot of questions we have about how soil ecosystem services interact with different management practices and other aspects of agriculture. So just a brief experimental overview. We have two types of soil, a silt loam and a sand loam, both from southern Ontario. We have two types of crop rotation, simple rotation, which just consists of soy and corn, and then a diverse rotation, which has a wheat year as well as cover crop after the wheat and corn. Finally, we have a winter warming treatment where we're increasing the soil temperature. You can see the bare soil in the center of the picture there, which is meant to simulate climate change. So all this goes together to create a lot of data which a number of different grad students are analyzing. We're just going to look at a bit of that. So right here we have evapotranspiration data from one day in May, and you can pretty clearly see that the diverse rotation had a total ET rate of over 5 millimeters per day for both the sand and loam, whereas the simple rotation, which didn't have much growing at that point, had a much lower ET rate. But that's just a snapshot. We also want to look at the trends over time. So something like that, we might look at yield. So here we have the seed yield for the soy and the total grain yield for the corn, and for the first 4 years of the experiment. And the first thing that pops out is that the loam has a higher yield than the sand. There's some other potential small reductions in yields due to the winter warming treatment, maybe because it makes the soil a little bit drier. We're also looking at things like nitrate concentration in the soil profile. So the top two graphs are without cover crops and the bottom two are with cover crops. And this is for nitrate concentrations at 5, 10, 30, 60, and 90 centimeters. And you can see that having cover crops reduces the concentration across the entire trend. And this is over 1 year, just under a year of data. Now, if you looked at the cumulative sums, you'll see that that means that cover crops can reduce nitrate leaching by 70 to 77%. Without cover crops, that nitrate would just drain down into groundwater and it would be inaccessible to crops. So unfortunately this year we haven't been able to have any tours, but we love having people out there and getting to work with all the different students and professors. And a big thanks to all of our collaborators. Thanks very much.
If you're interested in learning more about the lysimeter research or any other soil research that's happening at the University of Guelph, head on over to our webpage, soilsatguelph.ca. If you go to the News and Events tab, here we're going to be posting articles that are showing up online or study summaries that give you a summary of the results that are coming up from research studies that we've published. You can also subscribe to our newsletter by entering your email here. Our newsletter goes out every semester, and so you'll get updates that way as well. You can also follow us on Twitter at soilsatguelph. And finally, if you're interested in
in booking a tour of the Soil Health Interpretive Center. Head on over to our contact page. You can put your name and your email here, and we can book a tour with your group at some point in the future. We're also able to provide CEU credits for CCAs if you're interested in that. Thanks for watching.
Objectively evaluating soil structure is a very important tool for monitoring soil health, diagnosing issues with crop growth or drainage, and for determining if and what remedial action might be necessary. But it's kind of hard to do without an objective framework. Several exist, but the one that I like is called VES, the Visual Evaluation of Soil Structure. It provides guidance on scoring soil structure quality along a 5-point scale. Quick, easy, and in 10 to 15 minutes you should be able to complete a site. Let's see how it works. To conduct this test, you'll need the score sheet, a record sheet, tape measure, and a spade. I like to use a square spade for this. You might also want a hard surface to actually lay your block out when you're doing the test. Once you're at the site, start by digging a small trench slightly wider and deeper than your block, about 8 to 12 inches deep, depending on where the plow pan or compacted layer might be and whether you're trying to target it or not. You should try to dig the trench from 2 sides only. This helps to extract an intact block with minimal smearing and disturbance on at least 3 sides. Make a mental note of how tough the soil is to dig while you're doing this. Next, insert your spade about a spade width from the face of the trench and lever out the block. You might need to support the block face with your hand so that it doesn't fall apart. Then gently place it onto your hard surface and push it off of the spade. Once you've got your block, the first step is to identify any clearly different layers. Those should be scored separately. Note the depth of each layer, as that will be used to assign a weighted score to the whole block. So to do that, we'll gently try to tease this apart and see if we can feel and see any clear differences. Now I'm seeing a difference right at the surface here in the top 2 inches. So I'll go ahead and pull that out. The rest is looking reasonably similar. Very gently, try to just separate these aggregates. You want to use very little pressure and just get a sense of how they naturally break apart. And make a note of how easily these pieces crumble. That's our first score. So I'll break these up a little bit more and show you what I come up with. So now I've gently broken this up, and I'll grab a handful here for you to see. And you should be able to easily tell that most of these aggregates are fairly fine. They're 2 millimeters to definitely under 7 centimeters. There's no really cloddy ones, they're all nice and rounded. And if I take a slightly larger piece, you'll see that it breaks up into successively smaller aggregates and crumbles really easily. You'll also see that there are roots growing throughout these. Which makes sense, given that this was recently in wheat. And lastly, you can take a small fragment, just under an inch, 1 to 2 centimeters, and compare its general aspect to some of the pictures on your sheet. So this is clearly an SQ2 good quality soil, nice seed bed. Now as I start breaking out this second layer, you can already see that it's much blockier, that it's much more angular. It's got these sharp corners, and that generally the pieces are larger. They're tougher to break apart. And there's not as much going on within them. So I'll break these up a little bit more and show you what that looks like. So you can see I've broken these up now. Already the pieces look much larger than they did in the first layer. They're also not as nicely rounded. There are a lot of these sharp angles to these pieces. Now if I try to break one open with just one hand, most of these pieces do break without too much effort. And the size really ranges from small, 2 centimeters, to quite a bit larger, up to 10 centimeters. Not as much of those smaller pieces. Mixture between somewhat rounded and much more angular fragments. So if I crack one of these open, you'll see that there's really not as much of that internal aggregation or rounded porosity. There's some roots growing through these, but in other cases, those roots have obviously been confined to the cracks in between those aggregates. So this layer is displaying properties of both that SQ3 and SQ4, and in my opinion this is a soil that started at SQ4 and is moving its way up to SQ3 thanks to better management and rotation. And you can choose to give intermediate scores like a 3.5. For the purposes of this, we'll keep it simple and just call this an SQ3. Now that we have our layer scores, we can calculate the score of the entire block using a weighted average. So that was it. Let's see what that looks like under different conditions. So now we're on a real working farm, smelling quite fertile right now. This field has been no-till for about 25 years and has seen regular cover crops for the last 10 to 15. So let's see what we can find down there. Now, up to this point, we've been digging a trench and then extracting our block, but it's not always necessary. And so I know that here I'm in a nice Baynesville silt loam. It's not a very heavy soil, but I also have a good history with this field. I know just how mellow it's going to be. So I'm going to go ahead and try to extract this block with no trench. Let's see how it goes. That was nice. Got some stones. Just like that. And now let's lay it out carefully, just like we do the others. So again, we can kind of see that horizontal fracture here. That could be the depth of the last tillage. I'm feeling it quite loose down here. A little bit less up in this zone. Let's go ahead and separate these out. so you should be able to tell as I break this apart just how easily it crumbles. And all of these bigger pieces just fall apart into smaller and smaller aggregates. Very few individual particles, not seeing any disaggregation, but just lots of really lovely, nicely rounded aggregates, mostly under 6 millimeters. There's pores and roots all throughout this. This is top quality soil right here. That is fantastic. All right, so let's score that second layer. As you see, there are some stones in this. Real nice Bainesville silt loam. Toss those out because we don't need them, but that's another reason why you might actually want to use the single lever method, I guess you could call it, instead of digging the trench. Let's get into this. This is almost even more friable and loose and crumbly than what we had above. Oh no, that's a stone. Just look at this. This is your typical compacted layer in most Ontario soils. And you wouldn't find better in a permanent fence row. This is fantastic. And that's the effective management. There are a number of reasons why I really like soil structure as an indicator of soil health. It's responsive to management, and it reflects a range of chemical, physical, and especially biological processes that together create the aggregation and structuring that we see in our soils. And with enough practice and really very little training, you should be able to do it yourself. So with that, I'd like to thank all of the Eastern Ontario farmers who let me dig holes on their property. Thanks to the cameraman. And get digging.
Hi, I'm Chris Brown, Field Crop Sustainability Specialist with OMAFRA, and welcome to the Diagnostic Days. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of timing when applying manure on forages. When it comes to manure application, the ideal situation is to apply manure to growing crops when the risk of nutrient loss and compaction damage are low. So applying manure to forage crops is a good fit for these criteria. Nutrients to growing crops have a lot of advantages, and so a lot of people will apply manure to growing crops so that they can apply those nutrients when the crops are using those nutrients the most and at a time when the risk of environmental losses are a lot lower. The other advantage is that it's supplementing phosphorus and potash and sulfur and some of the other nutrients that the crop removes with each harvest. Applying manure to forages saves on commercial fertilizer dollars. It reduces storage requirements so that you don't have all that manure to apply last thing in the fall or first thing in the spring, and spreads out the workload when to times when it's not quite as busy. And then the biggest thing is that it also reduces the compaction damage that we get from manure application in spring or fall when soil conditions are wet. But the biggest advantage in addition to all of these is that manure on forages increases yield and quality by as much as 10 to 15%. So this video clip is showing a dribble bar manure applicator after second cut applying manure to a forage crop. It shows the 4 R's in the placement, in the width of the boom, in providing those nutrients close to where the crop needs it, and placing it close to the surface, reducing odors and losses. From a 4R perspective, applying manure to forages fits most of the criteria. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to focus mostly on one of the 4 R's, right timing. So right timing means during the growing season when crops are using the nutrients, and like I said before, we get less environmental risk of phosphorus loss, but also we get less risk of greenhouse gas emissions, especially nitrous oxide. We have lower risk of compaction, and partly because even if we get a rainy spell or a wet period, we have the choice of applying after first, second, and or third cut. And the most important thing is applying as soon as possible after harvest, which means generally fields that are harvested as haylage are going to get the manure first. So one of the biggest threats to damage for manure on forages is wheel traffic. And forage regrowth and yield, those are things that we have to be concerned about. And ask yourself, how many pieces of equipment travel over a field for each harvest? We've got mower, rake, harvester, forage wagons, and then finally manure equipment. And each of them generally have a tractor. Each of them have quite a few tires. And so compaction becomes an issue. And the real issue is the further advanced the growth is the regrowth of the alfalfa, the more damage that is caused to that forage. And so some of the things to consider: tire selection, PSI, inflation, deflation, width of manure application, and of course timing of application. So one thing is critical, and that is timing of application. We did some studies a couple of years ago that looked at how much yield impact is there from manure applied to forages that have regrown where you've got wheel track damage. And we had where manure was applied 9 days or 11 days after harvest, and we had a 33 to 50% yield reduction from the yield that was in those tire tracks. So the other thing that happened was you have the regrowth is not as far advanced as the rest of the field, and so there's a difference in quality, sometimes higher quality, but different than the rest of the field. The more regrowth we have after harvest, the greater the damage from the equipment traffic. Also, the drier the conditions, the less rain we've had, the more impact on yield from the damage from wheel traffic. Usually manure application is the final activity before the next harvest, so it makes you wonder, why is the wheel traffic so damaging? But it has everything to do with damage to the alfalfa regrowth and where that regrowth is occurring. On the left-hand side, you've got a plant with normal regrowth, no wheel traffic damage. And notice how the new growth coming up partway from the stem. This is called regrowth from the apical buds on the stem. And then there's other regrowth that occurs from the base of the plant or from the crown. Wheel traffic damages the regrowth, so the new growth has to start over and generally has to start from the crown. And this sets the plant back several days. This picture, it shows an example from this season. These pictures were taken 1 week after manure application following second cut during very dry conditions. These pictures show the alfalfa and the grass regrowth on a field where they were not damaged by traffic. Then these pictures were taken where there was wheel track damage and show the alfalfa plants regrowing, but with less stems and less growth than the plants that were not affected by that tire damage. This is that same field 2 weeks after manure application, and you can see that the regrowth is uniform and quite vigorous. Now, the other thing that we get asked about is, what about manure application to new seedings, and what is the impact of wheel traffic on those new seedings? Generally, we don't recommend manure application on new seedings because every stem is a plant. We don't have the crowns in place. And so any wheel traffic damage is going to exaggerate the loss of yield and even plant stand. And where we did do this experiment, we had a 25% decrease from manure applied to a new seeding. And that biggest yield disadvantage was in that wheel track. And even in the year following, we still had yield loss because we had applied manure to that new seeding. So just to summarize, 4 R's on manure application, we talk about having the right source of manure at the right rate, applied at the right time and in the right place. All of them are important, but for manure application to forages, timing will have the biggest impact on yield and soil properties. So I hope that you enjoy the rest of the diagnostic days. It's been Chris Brown. Thanks.
Hello, Ian McDonald from Manure here to chat with you this morning about biostrip till crop production. Firstly, thanks to brothers Lawrence Hogan and Steve Howard of the Lucknow area for letting me follow them around this season to chronicle their biostrip system and share it with the farm community. Let's talk about what a biostrip till system is and how it works. Most farmers are driven to tillage because of ruts, residue management, and false expectation that turning soil is required for good seedbed. A successful biostrip system shows that tillage, for the most part, offers no advantage and realistically costs a lot of dollars that people don't account for. Essentially, biocrop till involves using plants to till the soil. Cover crops are used following crop harvest to protect the soil, feed the soil environment, and define where the next crop will be growing. Some farmers plant a single cover crop for the wheel track area of the field and leave the corn row bare. Others use a two different crop mix system. We're going to discuss the latter today. Using the two cover crop mix system establishes separate tracks for different plant mixes for the wheel traffic and where the corn rows will be planted the next season. These cover crops are planted early to take advantage of the remainder of the growing season. In the spring, the corn row crop mix has died out and almost ready for planting the corn, and the wheel track mix containing winter hardy species is continuing to grow and feed and protect the soil life early in the spring and provide a solid footing for equipment to travel on the field even if the soil conditions are a bit tough. But let's step back for a minute and understand the biostrip system. Why would you use this system? People venture into biostrip till usually because they're interested in eliminating tillage from their operation in pursuit of enhanced soil health, soil erosion protection, reduced production costs, and better labor efficiency while optimizing yield and revenue to achieve maximum long-term sustainable profit. The goal is to keep the ground covered with living plants 24/7, 365. It's additionally about managing those plants in ways that doesn't force you towards tillage. This system goes beyond normal strip till with the goal of eliminating even the very targeted tillage component associated with normal strip till. They use another method of creating that corn row cleared strip come spring, either by not planting cover crops there, planting green into specifically chosen cover crop mix, or using a machine to clear cover crops from the corn row area. They want plants growing in that space until freeze up and then the residue staying in place until spring. The usual starting point for the system is cereals, where the management goal is obviously to get a great yield. In this case, 110 bushels per acre, despite only half an inch of rain since the 23rd of June up until harvest. You want a uniform standing crop that is harvested quickly at maturity, as timing is critical to success in terms of maintaining cereal quality and planting the biostrips and giving them growing time over the remainder of the season. Avoiding lodging is also critical because biostrip till is primarily about residue management to ensure optimized seeding, germination, emergence, and growth of the biostrip species, and the same for the corn the following spring. Laid down matted cereals that can't be picked up by the combine hinder the system. Straw and chaff management is critical. Straw can be spread or removed. Some purists balk at straw removal, but because the ground is not tilled and immediately drilled into cover crops after cereal harvest, the possible negative aspects of straw removal are eliminated to a high degree, and so it works. Even with the best of equipment, straw and chaff management can be challenging. In this case, Lawrence and Steve added the optional top-of-the-line chaff chopper spreader, which is fully capable of spreading across the 35 width of the header. However, here where they are combining and moving north-south, you see the impact of the west wind coming from the left and pushing the spread chaff back towards the windrow. This potentially leads to a mat of chaff that hinders cover crop seeding and germination success. Note that the chaff is spread separately from the straw coming out the back. This again is a critical piece, especially when baling off the straw. Spend the money on the best residue management package for the combine you can. Ensure that if you're custom combining, that the operator is as concerned about straw and chaff management as you are. Make sure your drill is in good shape for seeding. The goal is a smooth, uniform field platform that is perfect for optimizing the direct seeding of cover crops right after harvest. Note the big rubber tires on the tractor in this case, part of the system to optimize the platform by reducing the potential for soil compaction. This drill is equipped with an additional tank on the back for one cover crop mix in the biostrip system and for supplying in-furrow P when planting wheat. Some in biocrop systems plant only one mix in the wheel track area of the field, leaving the corn row area completely bare to facilitate planting the next spring. In this case, Steve and Lawrence use a two-mix system. Since these are multi-species mixes of different seed sizes, there is some settling that occurs with the jostling of the drill going across the field. So they stop every so often to mix the seed again manually. The two cover crop recipes used are quite complex. Each averages about 40 pounds per acre of seed, and the per acre average cost across the field is $31 per acre. Note that the recipes include combinations of grass and broadleaf species. Also, for the wheel track strip, some of the species overwinter to grow in the spring, while the corn row ones all die out in fall, resulting in dead plant residue already starting to decay, making setup for corn planting easy. The biostrip mixes don't have to be this complex, but Lawrence and Steve like the look of the range of species growing in the field. As well, the multi-species mix established in the field, especially in a tough year, will segregate out by soil type and soil condition, such that a simple recipe might not have a uniform ground cover across the entire landscape. So let's just watch the progression of the seeded cover crops as they develop through fall. This runs us out of time for this session, but here's a spring teaser if you're interested in what happens in the spring. So if you're interested in more on Lawrence and Steve's system, including row cleaning, corn planting, fertilizer program, weed control, and more, tune into the 2021 Ontario Crops Conference in January and check out our articles on www.fieldcropnews.com. Thanks very much and have a great day.
Hi, I'm Doug Young from the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about soil pH. Soil pH affects many of the things that we do in growing a crop. It affects the effectiveness of herbicides as well as affecting the nutrients availability and uptake by crops. Different crops require different soil pH ranges to grow best in. For example, corn will grow at lower pHs down to even 5.5 on clay soils and still do quite well, where a crop like alfalfa requires higher pHs around 6.5 to grow its best. Soil pH is quite variable. I did an experiment a few years ago where we had 10-foot by 30-foot plots, and we did a soil pH on each of those plots, and in about a half an acre, pHs ranged from about 4, which most crops that we grow don't grow very well at pH 4, up to a pH of about 6.5, where we could grow just about any crop we wanted to. That was in just 1/2 of an acre, and so indicating that pH is quite variable as you travel across a field. Soil pH can affect some of the herbicides that we use as well. In particular, the triazines and sulfonylureas are affected because the persistence changes in the soil as well as the availability of those herbicides will change as well. Typically, as the soil pH goes up, the persistence of the herbicides will remain greater, so there's a greater possibility of carryover the following year. At lower pHs, the triazines and sulfonylureas will attach to soil particles, adsorb the soil particles, and that will reduce their persistence as well as enable them to break down faster in the soil, so there's less risk of carryover of those particular herbicides. One of the very first things I look at on a soil test report is the soil pH. Soil pH can tell us a lot about what's going on in the soil. Some of the nutrient deficiencies that we have in Ontario are solely the result of too high or too low of a soil pH. It doesn't seem to matter what's in the soil. If the pH is too high or too low, then the nutrient availability will be such that the crop can't pick up those nutrients. Nutrients that are less available at high pHs are usually the micronutrients. So things like copper, zinc, manganese, boron, as well as phosphorus, which is the macronutrient, are less available at high pHs. At low pHs, the macronutrients tend to be less available. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, and magnesium tend to be less available at lower soil pHs. You may have noticed that I mentioned phosphorus being less available both at high pH and low pH. That's because phosphorus just in general isn't all that available, and as the pH gets higher or gets lower, phosphorus is tied up and becomes less available at both ends of the pH scale. There are some nutrients we can focus more upon when we're talking about soil pH in Ontario. As the pH goes down, magnesium tends to be the nutrient that becomes less available. Magnesium deficiency is quite common in corn and will show up as interveinal striping on the lower leaves of the plant, indicating that the nutrient is mobile within the plant. And so we'll get the interveinal striping on the lower leaves, the older growth of the plant, and as the deficiency progresses, the edges or margins of the leaf will turn a reddish color on corn. With soybeans and wheat, magnesium deficiency shows up as interveinal chlorosis of the older leaves. It's important to note it's the older leaves of the plant and not the newer leaves. Older leaves indicate the nutrient is mobile and will indicate magnesium deficiency, where if the newer leaves you start seeing interveinal chlorosis on the newer leaves, it's a different nutrient deficiency altogether. Magnesium deficiency can be corrected in one of two ways. The first way to correct magnesium deficiency is to raise the soil pH. If magnesium deficiency is caused by low pH, then you can raise the soil pH using lime. The preferable lime source would be dolomitic lime because it contains magnesium as well as calcium, and so that will help get rid of the deficiency. The other way to get rid of magnesium deficiency, if pH isn't the main issue, is by adding magnesium fertilizers. So sulfomag can be used, but whenever you need lime, you can also use a dolomitic limestone because that does contain magnesium, which will help prevent magnesium deficiencies in those soils down the road. When the soil pH is on the higher side, we start seeing some of the micronutrient deficiencies show up. Most commonly in Ontario, we see manganese, zinc, and boron deficiencies. Manganese and zinc deficiencies show up on row crops typically, where boron deficiency will show up most commonly on forage crops, particularly alfalfa. What's interesting about the field crops, the row crops, is that if they show manganese deficiency, usually they don't show zinc deficiency, and vice versa. A good example is corn. Corn has zinc deficiency showing quite commonly on high pH soils in Ontario. However, we almost never see manganese deficiency in corn. In soybeans and wheat, it's manganese deficiency that is most common, where zinc deficiency is relatively rare in those crops in Ontario. Zinc deficiency in corn occurs on high pH soils, sometimes with very high phosphorus levels, which can interfere with the uptake of zinc. Zinc deficiency in corn shows up in the topmost leaves of plants, indicating that the nutrient is not mobile inside the plant, and it shows up as broad white stripes, one on each side of the midrib on the topmost leaves of the plant. Corn also is shorter when it has zinc deficiency because the internodes get shortened. Manganese deficiency is also induced by high pH. Manganese deficiency in Ontario shows up mostly on soybeans and cereal crops, and with both, it shows up as interveinal chlorosis of the topmost leaves of the plant. Correcting manganese deficiency is different than trying to correct zinc deficiency. Manganese deficiency occurs because of the high pHs, and if you apply manganese to the soil, the manganese will get tied up and become unavailable to the plant. So the best way to fix manganese deficiency in crops, in soybeans and wheat, is to apply the manganese fertilizer as a foliar application, and that's when you first see the manganese deficiency occurring, and that should fix the problem. In severe cases, you may have to go through and put a second foliar application of manganese on the crop. There is a good soil test for both manganese and zinc in Ontario. The amount of zinc and manganese in the soil are measured, and there's a correction factor put in for the pH of the soil. As the pH goes up, availability of zinc and manganese goes down, and so with high pHs, the zinc and manganese index typically will be lower, indicating the need for manganese and zinc to be applied to the appropriate crops at the appropriate time. Boron deficiency is common on high pH soils with alfalfa. It typically shows up on coarse textured soils in drier springs. So boron becomes less available when there's not enough moisture in the ground, and so the alfalfa crop can't pick it up. Boron deficiency in alfalfa is a yellowing or reddening of the top half of the leaves on the top of the plant. As the boron deficiency gets more severe, the leaves get more red and they can die. Boron deficiency can be corrected with a broadcast application of boron. Don't ban boron because it's very easy to go from a deficiency to a surplus of boron, which can become toxic to the plant. Correcting soil pH in Ontario generally refers to raising the soil pH. We can use the dolomitic lime or calcitic lime to raise the pH. If you require magnesium, dolomitic lime is the limestone to use. If you do not require any magnesium and your magnesium levels are high enough in your soils, then calcitic lime is the choice for you. Lime is incorporated and then incorporated into the soil. You don't absolutely have to incorporate, but the effect of lime will be much greater and much faster if you incorporate the lime into the soil. A few years ago we looked at surface application in no-till of lime, and it did alter the pH of the soil, but only in the top few centimeters. You might want to just alter the top few centimeters if you're a no-till farmer and you're using triazines or sulfonylureas, but generally you do want to work the lime in. If you want to lower the soil pH, then typically we use sulfur. However, it's only in very exceptional circumstances that we actually use sulfur to lower the pH. You only use sulfur if you're growing a fairly high value crop that requires low soil pHs, like blueberries or perhaps potatoes. And we generally only apply sulfur and lower the pH on coarse textured soils. It requires far too much sulfur to lower the soil pH on clay soils or high organic matter soils that has a high cation exchange capacity. Soil pH can have profound influences on crop growth in Ontario. It can affect herbicides and the effectiveness of herbicides, as well as affecting the uptake of nutrients and the availability of nutrients in the soil. Properly maintaining the soil pH in the appropriate range for the crops that you're growing is a sound practice and is very important to maximize production and maximize returns in Ontario agriculture.
There you have it. I hope you enjoyed episode 4 of Ontario Diagnostic Days. Certainly a tour de force of soil health management information. On our next episode, we're going to focus on crop growth staging and how you can use that information to manage your crop. We'll have that on September 9th. So, we'll see you then.